The controller is probably the most overlooked aspect of any video game experience. And I don't mean how the game controls, I mean the controller itself. Barring the examples with weird shapes and just generally confusing design choices, the controller tends to fall into the background of any gamer's mind as they sit down to enjoy their latest round of Gary Kitchen's Battle Tank, the classic we all know and love. But today, I want to throw some attention towards the video game controller. Not just any controller, though. I want to do something that's a little unique, you know, not too out of left field, but something just enough to...
One Zulu Niner pre-flight check.
Roger, Tower.
Turbo A.
That's a go.
Turbo B.
Check.
Cyclone control.
A-OK.
Rapid fire.
All right, let's fire it up.
The NES Max, only from Nintendo.
Whoa. Now that's more like it. Released in 1989, model NES 027, or the NES Max, was released as an updated version of the classic NES controller, featuring a more rounded shape, turbo functionality, and perhaps most noticeably, the replacement of the traditional cross-shaped directional pad in favor of this new Cyclone pad. And unlike other replacement Nintendo controllers, such as the acclaimed remote controller, the NES Max was developed by Nintendo themselves, which meant there was going to be at least a bit more quality control than a cheaper third party, such as, say, LJN. But the design didn't stick. I mean, when people think of the NES controller, they still think of this classic rectangular gray brick. The NES Max was just kind of relegated to being that weird boomerang controller with a wonky circle pad thingy instead of a D-pad. Was this the result of the controller's late release and the console's lifespan? Possibly. I mean, it was released in 1989, and at least in North America, the Super Nintendo was only 2 years away from its 1991 launch date, so maybe this just didn't get enough time to resonate with audiences enough to leave an impact. Or maybe it's just a god-awful controller, and I have wasted $14 of my own money. Let's find out. I picked a few relatively well-known games to take our little buddy here out for a test drive, each to see how well certain aspects of the controller work. Let's start off with a bona fide classic, Super Mario Bros. Okay, right away I'm having no trouble with the responsiveness of the controls. Everything is responding as it should, and the A and B buttons work like a charm. Clustered charm, that is. Yeah, in spite of the fact that the Max is roughly the same size as the original NES controller, a consequence of its rounded design is that it has less surface area to work with. Everything is more tightly packed in together, and while it never got to the point where I was pressing buttons accidentally, I'd be lying if I said that my hands didn't feel a bit cramped with a layout like this. Honestly, I'm not even sure why they decided they needed to round out the edges of the NES controller. Okay, yeah, the rectangular shape can dig into your hands at times, but that's only when you're really clinging on tight. But the tight spacing due to the rounded design isn't the controller's weakest aspect, as this next game will show. Some of you may be wondering just what the deal is with the circle pad on the Max. Well, here's the lowdown. You know the circle pad on the 3DS? That thing that basically acted as a flat analog stick of sorts? That thing that almost looks exactly like the Cyclone pad on the Max? Well, that's where the similarities end, because the NES Max's Cyclone pad works nothing like an analog stick. And look at all of you out there just assuming this gamepad's movement functionality. It's 2020, guys. It's allowed to be whatever it wants to be. Stop being such boomers. Ugh. Yeah, while the Cyclone pad may look like an analog stick of some sort, it's actually just a dressed-up D-pad. And trust me, I cracked open both an original controller and the Max for this video, and they both have the same parts under the hood. You still only have inputs for the 8 cardinal directions, and most importantly, you have to press down in a direction in order for the input to register. This is not an analog stick where you can just move the D-pad in a direction that will register in its input. You have to push down just like a regular D-pad in order for it to work. Now, some of you may be wondering, well then, if that's the case, what's all the use of the pomp and circumstance? I mean, why not just have a regular D-pad? And honestly, I don't really have an answer for you. To be fair, there are some controllers out there, such as the PlayStation 1s, where the D-pad seemingly cuts through your fingers like a knife, but the original NES controller's D-pad, in spite of its cross shape, is actually pretty comfortable. Even when I'm jamming my finger down repeatedly, the pad is just rounded enough that no edges actually wind up biting into my skin. In fact, the circle pad is actually kind of worse than the traditional D-pad. With the D-pad, it's easy to feel which direction you're pushing down on since it has that distinctive cross shape. Because of the circular shape of the Cyclone pad, you don't have that same assurance that you're pressing down on the direction you want, especially if you're like me and tend to tilt your arms when holding a controller. To be fair, you can get used to this if you're careful enough, but as can be seen in my Tetris footage, when fast and accurate movements are required, the extra care needed to make sure you're even moving in the direction you want to can be the difference between success and failure. Maybe a game a little less reliant on quick movement then? Alright, this is what I'm talking about. Shooters such as Millipede are where the Max quite frankly shines in my opinion. Movement doesn't have to be quite as precise for the most part, and the turbo functionality means that you can just hold your finger down and watch the points rack up. Now, is that technically cheating? But now comes the final challenge, because you see, Punch-Out isn't just one of my favorite games of all time. No. Its quick and strict timing that it asks of the player makes it a perfect test for lag and responsiveness. The real question is the Max up to the challenge? Come on! Yeah! Alright. You know what? If I can make a basketball bowl with this thing, I might just be willing to give it my seal of approval.
They ask you how you are, you just have to say that you're fine when you're not really fine, but you just can't get into it because...
Overall, the NES Max is pretty good. Better than the original NES controller, though, I wouldn't say so. The simple fact of the matter is that the Cyclone pad, while it is perfectly functional in place of a D-pad, isn't really an outright improvement, and while the turbo buttons are certainly a nice convenience, not many games outside of shooters, at least games that are worth playing, really require rapid button mashing to begin with. While its more rounded design can be seen as an improvement over the at times harsh and rough edges of the original NES controller, the fact of the matter is that it still suffers from a relatively small size that may make the experience uncomfortable for some people. The long and short of it is that the NES Max was a solution in search of a problem to solve, and while it is a perfectly serviceable product, it's far from a necessary one. Especially when nowadays it costs about twice as much as a classic NES controller. Unless you're a collector, I wouldn't really recommend the investment. But hey, I mean, looks cool at least. Anyways, I'm Blockhead. If you enjoyed what you saw, be sure to leave a like, comment. If you want to see more, subscribe with that little notification bell. Regardless of what you do, however, I hope to see you all again another time. But now comes the final challenge. Punch-Out isn't just one of my favorite games of all time. It makes for an excellent test of lag and responsiveness with its quick and strict timing. But the real question is the Max... That's stupid. Ugh. This is my hair. Ugh. But now comes the final challenge. Punch-Out isn't just one of my favorite games of all time. It makes for an excellent taste.